Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest biweekly China econ update. My name is Andrew Polk, co-founder of Trivium China, here as always with my partner in crime, our head of markets, China markets research, Denny McMahon. Denny, thanks for joining me again today.
Always a pleasure, Andrew.
So 2 weeks ago, we did a flash talk looking ahead to the two sessions, the MPC in China. And in the intervening 2 weeks, the MPC took place and is now over. And so we'll be looking back at some of the key takeaways. Before we dive in, as always, please feel free to share these biweekly updates with colleagues or anyone else who you think should be a Trivium subscriber. Always have to give that plug. We really appreciate the word of mouth suggestions from all of our clients for new clients to come in. And with that, we'll dive right in. So, looking at the NPC, obviously just a little bit of background. The two sessions meets every year in March. It's the government meetings that set major policy directives for the year. A lot of those directives are decided previous to the two sessions by party bodies. For example, in December, the previous December, the Central Economic Work Conference happens. That's a party level meeting, and a lot of the key decisions are made at that meeting, and then translated into government speak in the intervening months, and then released to the public in March. So today we're going to dive into the big econ takeaways. We have a flash talk for both our markets and our Neopol subscribers tomorrow on Thursday that will be live, where we'll talk about some of the broader political impacts, tech impacts, etc. So Denny, what are the key things that you were looking at from the NPC, the key kind of macro policy decisions that were made that we're going to get into today?
Right. So as with every NPC, the starting point is we're always looking for the targets for the year ahead. So that's always the GDP target. It is the budget deficit for the year, and it is the annual quota for special purpose bonds, which is what the local governments use to drive infrastructure investment in the year ahead. And it's those three things which kind of give us an indication as to what the government envisions for economic growth and how it's going to achieve it. We'll go through each of those one by one, but clearly the one everybody's looking for, first cab off the rank, is the GDP target, which was set at around 5% for the year ahead. Now, that was kind of lower, not below people's expectations, but it was the lower end of the range. So it was less than the around 5.5% target that was set last year. And broadly, people were thinking maybe it'd be 5.5 again, maybe it could be as high as 6. So coming in at 5, it was on the low side. And although we aren't privy to the internal decision making of China's regulators, what we think this is about as much as anything is that China's trying to do something this year that it has not ever really done before, and that is put consumption at the heart of the economic motor. So in the past, it's always been about exports, and failing exports, it's always been about the property sector, and it's about infrastructure driving growth. And we can't really rely on any of those things this year. I mean, given doubts about the health of the global economy in the year ahead, certainly given pressures on households in Europe and the US, particularly from inflationary pressures, no one's really expecting exports to drive the Chinese economy this year. And if anything, it might actually be a drag on growth. Same goes for property. We think potentially it'll have a positive impact by the end of the year, but again, property could, much like last year, it could be a drag on growth again. Infrastructure will be a major contributor, but probably not to the same extent as last year. Infrastructure investment was 11% last year. It's very difficult to do that 2 years in a row, particularly when it leans so heavily on local governments borrowing, and they're already fairly financially overstretched. So consumption is at the heart of the growth story this year. Xi Jinping said as much in the Central Economic Work Conference in December. The entire government apparatus is on board. But the difference between consumption and property, and the difference between consumption and in infrastructure, is that you can't turn up the dial and turn down the dial in the same way. So traditionally, China's authorities have regulated the economy through the provision and the cost of credit. If they want to stimulate the economy, they pump more credit in and they lower the cost, and state-owned firms who are not particularly sensitive to default risks, they go in, they borrow, and they build. And that has allowed China to set fairly arbitrary growth targets, and reasonably consistently year in, year out, they hit those targets because it's built around a system driven by credit. Consumption doesn't work that way. Consumption is very much dependent on the individual decisions of literally hundreds of millions of households in China. Pushing more credit into the economy doesn't fix that. In fact, the authorities are sensitive about households borrowing more because they feel like they were already overstretched in certain ways. So this isn't a simple model of driving growth in the way that they have in the past. And so we think they've erred on the side of a more conservative GDP target because they know that, achieving that target is going to be a little bit more complicated than it has in the past. It's not that they can't do better. It's just that, it's not going to work in the same way as they have, as it has in the past. So that's the first thing that we were kind of looking at, that GDP target, and that's kind of our interpretation of what it means. Now, of course,
Well,
the second.
Can I jump in there real quick with a question for you, Dennis? Sorry. A lot of clients are asking the question, is the fact that the target came in at the lower end of the range indicative of official concern about how well the economy is going to perform? Does it indicate that they're not willing to provide as much economic support as maybe the market thought? Does it just indicate that things are more uncertain around the economy than maybe investors were thinking? And it sounds like you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong or agree with this, that it's really not about them showing concern or thinking they can't achieve higher growth. It's really about sending a signal to the system. Yes, growth is important, but we don't want to go crazy on the investment, crazy on the infrastructure side, as we always would have in the past. So it's sort of an internal expectations management or an internal signaling of around like, how are we going to achieve growth this year, as much as it is about the actual number. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the authorities have been talking for years now about high quality growth, and it's so easy to kind of dismiss slogans when they're said over and over again. But that's where there are so many dynamics about the Chinese economy, at play at the moment, where relying on the old playbook of growth, just pumping more credit into the system to meet arbitrary targets, they're not willing to do it anymore. Partly because, given the challenges that they have with the United States and demographics and whatnot, it's not worth accumulating the debt for to invest in projects that aren't going to serve their longer term economic interests. And at the same time, they recognize that they need to start restructuring the economy. I mean, they've recognized it for ages, but now we're kind of at a point where the rubber really meets the road, that the economy needs to be driven by things like domestic demand in the future, rather than more and more investment in the same old channels. And so there's there's a whole lot of factors for why lower growth makes sense, for why they're not willing to set a higher target, and it's all coming together at once. But I don't think it necessarily reflects concerns and worries and unwillingness to kind of sort of support growth. I think it's I think 5% is nonetheless a pretty robust target, and I think conceivably, depending on how things shake out this year, it could be higher.
Yeah. Well, I cut you off. We were just about, I think you were about to transition into some of the other targets. So maybe a good time to talk about the fiscal pieces. I think before we do that, just want to kind of frame this up. We were talking to a client yesterday, and they were asking, is the 2023 5% a redux of kind of what happened last year? And to put this in context, last year they set the growth target at around 5.5%, which for that year seemed like a very ambitious target. So 5.5 was a stretch goal last year, and 5 this year, based on how weak growth was in 2022, a 5% growth target for this year, 2023, is actually considered low. So, it's all about kind of perspective and placement and where we are in the cycle. And last year it was pretty clear at this time that 5.5% growth was really kind of incongruous with some of the more specific policy settings, specifically how much fiscal support they were willing to give. And so last year at this time, we said, something's got to give here. They're either going to have to ramp up fiscal support or support more generally for the economy, or they're going to miss their growth target. They're going to have to climb back from it. Ultimately, largely because of COVID, they had to climb down from the growth target, which we didn't think would happen, but that wasn't our first choice of how things would likely play out, but that's where we are. Now clients are asking, okay, are we at the same place? 5% growth, still pretty punchy, but at the lower end of expectations. And do we now have fiscal settings that match with that? So what are the fiscal settings? Walk us through, and then let's talk about, do those settings seem appropriate for the growth target that we have this year?
Well, there are two big aspects of the sort of the fiscal targets or the fiscal numbers that sort of came out during the MPC. First is the budget deficit. So this year the target budget deficit has been set at 3% compared to 2.8% last year. And then the other big figure to look at is the special purpose bond quota. And so this year, the SPB quota is 3.8 trillion renminbi, and that's up from 3.65 trillion renminbi last year. But of course, that's a little bit misleading because although last year's quota was 3.65 trillion, the Ministry of Finance then allowed local governments to issue an additional 500 billion worth of SPBs at the very end of the year. And so in terms of total approved issuance for last year, it was about 4.15 trillion. Now, they didn't quite get to that level, but it was pretty close. So it's kind of difficult to know exactly how to compare this year with last, because this year's target this quota is 150 billion more than last year. So that would say that at the beginning of the year, the central government has allocated a moderate amount of growth for local government borrowing over last year's target. However, in actual fact, it's kind of what they've said is that, well, they're going to issue less this year because of that additional 500 billion quota last year. What we think is that, it's given what they did last year, there's now always that question hanging over. There'll always be this question hanging over us. If growth isn't fast enough in the last couple of quarters, will the central government step in and give local governments an extra bit of a quota? It's almost as though that quota at the beginning of the year, where once upon a time it was a hard and fast indication of how much local governments would be able to borrow in the year ahead, it no longer feels that way. So that's kind of the big question at the moment. Firstly, local governments are approved to issue less than they were last year, but will that change towards the end of the year if the central government feels as though things need a little bit more of an injection of life into the economy? So that's kind of the first issue. Then as for the budget deficit, Andrew, I'll throw back to you. What are your thoughts about what they're trying to do, what these numbers are about?
Yeah, so I think that the net takeaway here for both of these is likely moderately more fiscal support as we start the year. The budget deficit's raised a little bit, so from 2.8 to 3. The initial SPB target is raised a little bit from 3.65 trillion to 3.8 trillion. Even though ultimately they came in with more special purpose bond quota late last year. Where we start the year is slightly more fiscal support. It's really difficult as we've assessed this to kind of figure out the exact amount of additional fiscal support for a couple of reasons. One, as you said, on the SPBs, the numbers were in flux last year. On the fiscal deficit side, there's a few things that are kind of strange. One is, they're raising the budget deficit, but they're also expecting that, as the economy kind of naturally rebounds, that government revenues should increase substantially. So if you have substantially increased revenues plus a higher fiscal deficit, that could actually mean a lot more expenditure. Of course, last year they also augmented their revenues through a couple of sort of one-off tricks, transferring money from the PBOC and the tobacco, the main tobacco producer, some key SOEs of around 2 trillion RMB into the fiscal coffers. So it's also hard to assess exactly what the ultimate budget deficit was last year because they kind of augmented their revenues. So on balance, we'll say, taking all of those factors into account, what we think is it's a moderate, very moderate increase in fiscal support. But really what matters to us even more than the overall number for the year, both on SPBs and the fiscal deficit, is really when they spend it temporally. And what we mean is it's really about how much they can get out the door early in the year as the economy continues to try to find its feet on the back of the whole this dismantling of the zero COVID policy. Can they get a large number of SPBs out the door in Q1, right? It's already, we're 15, 16 days away from the end of Q1, but Q1 and into the first part of Q2, can they do pack the fiscal expenditures as much as possible into the first part of the year? And that's where we think they are really focused. On the SPBs, the early quotas are very significantly larger than they were last year in terms of for Q1 in the first part of the year. So they're trying not just to spend about the same amount as they did last year, they're trying to really pack that into the early part of the year to help the economy further stabilize, jolt the economy into a better position on the back of some additional infrastructure spending, ongoing infrastructure spending from last year. And we think that's largely in hopes of kind of trying to get sort of lift off speed so that then they, as they hope soon, they can hand that economic momentum off from the government to consumers. And, if they can get some economic momentum going as part of that handoff, that will add to business and consumer confidence. If things look like they're improving, employment's coming down a little bit, the overall health of the economy seems like it's more robust and growth is accelerating, that just boosts sentiment among businesses and households. And then the hope then is that consumers come back and stand in the breach and drive growth later in the year. So that's how I tend to kind of frame this up. Slightly increased overall fiscal support, but substantially increased fiscal support early in the year. Does that sound about how you're reading it?
Yeah, I concur with that. I think that sums it up quite well. I don't have much to add.
So, I think where we are now, there are big questions here as to still uncertainties around really how strongly the economy will perform. The early data seems to have put officials at ease, making them seem sort of less urgent and adding new support measures, adding additional support for the property market, for example. They see the need to do it, but they're not panicking, it seems. That said, the market and us as analysts are not quite sure how much the growth trajectory has legs, right? So we're still in an area of uncertainty, and the big question is not really what the government's doing so much as what will consumers do, right? So let's dive in on that a little bit before we get to some of the other aspects of the NPC around the financial restructuring and things. Where are we on what happened in terms of consumption of the NPC, and how do you think officials are now thinking about that whole aspect of the growth trajectory this year?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that post-zero COVID, people are consuming more. It's just the way that it is. Last year was a terrible year for consumption. In December, I think retail sales contracted by about 1.8%. In last year, for the whole year, consumption contracted by, I think, 0.2% or something like that. So last year was terrible. And this year, by the sheer fact that sort of the lockdown and the threat of lockdowns have been lifted, people are already just consuming more. However, the regulators are worried. So, in the NPC, in its report, sorry, the NDRC, the economic planner, in its report to the NPC, said as much, how that they're worried that people just aren't confident enough to spend. The PBOC, the central bank, immediately before the NPC said as much in its third quarter monetary policy report, that coming off the back of 3 years of COVID, people's balance sheets have been damaged, and that people just don't have the confidence to spend. They're worried about their own family's financial outlook. Although they're kind of being released from lockdown, that confidence isn't there yet. Ministry of Finance, exactly the same thing, asking this question: how do you make people willing to spend and confident to spend? All in the space of a week, hearing from 3 major financial regulators saying that, where consumption is at the moment, yes, consumption's coming back. No, it's not quite at the level yet that the authorities need it to be for it to kind of play this central role driving the economy. So what we've really seen over the last few weeks is, we think that the foundations of very much a 3-prong approach to sort of putting consumption kind of at the center of the economy has kind of started to emerge. And the first prong is boosting confidence by getting by sort of boosting economic growth quickly. The second is by encouraging people to spend more through incentives. And the third prong is putting more money in people's pockets such that they have the resources to spend more. Now, that first prong is very much about infrastructure. So Andrew was talking about this before. When it comes to the whole fiscal side of the equation, the real question is how much gets rolled out the door now? And we saw this with the SPB, the special purpose bond quota. Although the annual quota was only marginally higher than last year, the preliminary quota, which is the amount that local governments are expected to deploy in the first half of the year, was 2.1 trillion renminbi, which is 50% higher than the 1.4 trillion preliminary quota that was set for last year. So that's a very significant increase in the amount of local government debt that the central government wants to see deployed at the start of the year. And I think we're already seeing this with in the data. So today, the January-February economic data came out, and infrastructure investment increased, I think it was 12.2% year on year. Now that's marginally lower than 12.3% in December, but nonetheless, that is an absolute cracking pace. I mean, a 12% increase in infrastructure investment year on year is really, I mean, this is very aggressive stimulatory action. But the thing is, we don't expect this to last for the entire year. The whole point of the exercise is to create an economic recovery now such that households start to feel more confident about the state of the Chinese economy and, by extension, their own economic prospects. And so when they look at the economy and they see the construction and they feel the cash flowing through the economy again, they will start to spend more. So that is the first prong of what the central authorities are trying to achieve at the moment. The second prong is incentives for people to spend more. Now, we've talked about this before with what the local governments have been doing over the last few months. This was the first instance in which the central government waded in and said, this is the stuff that needs to happen. And this came in the form of the NDRC's report to the NPC. Specifically, they talked a little bit about tourism. They want to see encouragement of tourism, particularly, short trips and, long weekends and holidays nearby. They also talked about ensuring that paid holiday leave gets honored so that people feel confident in taking more holidays. And they also talked a little bit about subsidy programs. Now, what they were very specific about is they don't want all local governments going out and subsidizing consumption. They only want the ones who can afford it. Now, that's going to be a big issue this year because a lot of local governments are already overstretched. The last thing they want is additional burdens that they can't afford. But for those local governments that can afford it, the focus will be on subsidies for green building materials, and it will be subsidies for green and smart appliances. NDRC also talked about ensuring stability of auto and big ticket item sales. We think that's probably because last year was a pretty good year for auto sales, particularly with a bunch of subsidies, and that sort of, it might be difficult this year to kind of maintain sort of the pace that we saw last year. So that's the side of the equation, which is, okay, it's time to get people spending again, dipping into their savings, bringing forward consumption decisions, but all, giving people reasons to spend now. Now, the third prong, and we think this is perhaps the most important one, is that this is explicitly about putting more money in people's pockets. So up until now, most of the discussion has been about, well, the Chinese households, they saved so much in 2022. The real aim of the game should be to get them to spend down those savings. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that might not happen. Big chunk of that was just money that would have otherwise gone to the stock market, otherwise been used to buy a house. Some of it was precautionary because people were worried about the outlook for the year ahead, and they're likely to remain a little bit cautious for the next few months. But it's not enough simply to encourage people to spend down their savings. What they really want, if you want to make people more confident about their household's financial situation, if you want to make them more confident about their financial outlook, if you really want to make them more confident about changing their consumption patterns rather than making just a one-off splurge, then the only thing you can do is put more money in their pockets. And this is something that China's central authorities have been talking about since Xi Jinping rolled out common prosperity in 2020, but we haven't really seen much progress on because of zero COVID, and they were kind of scrambling to try and work out how to maintain this thing. On top of that, we think there's probably a lot of political, there's always going to be a bit of sort of vested interests pushing back against this sort of thing, because if you are going to put more money in people's pockets, it means that you're going to have to either increase debt or come up with more taxation or somehow redirect the nation's wealth, particularly from the state-owned sector, into the pockets of households, and that's going to come up with some sort of pushback. But NDRC was very explicit in its report to the NPC this year, and it said that it is going to strive to increase wages. Now, it didn't talk about whose wages, but we're guessing this is probably state employees. Again, this is a sort of reallocation from the state sector to households. Presumably, this might mean that SOEs have lower profits because they're paying out more to their employees. That's something to watch for. They also talked about making sure that migrant workers get paid. But perhaps the other big thing was they were talking about reallocating, giving households more through the taxation system, through social security, and through direct transfers. Now, as yet, we don't know what that's going to look like, but the NDRC was explicit, and they were explicit that these are going to be the tools that they use to boost consumption this year. So I think perhaps that's going to be the most interesting space, because that you start making those changes, and that's not just about boosting consumption this year. It is really one of the first steps towards restructuring the Chinese economy and by reallocating the nation's wealth. And that is the thing that needs to happen, such that we don't have to rely on property investment and infrastructure construction so much, because households have more resources to spend. So that is how we see the three-prong approach. It's about boosting household consumption now by getting the economy back on track. It's about encouraging people to spend more of what they already have. And then it's about giving households more so that they can spend more.
Yeah, great summary. I guess that we're getting short on time. Maybe we'll go 5 minutes over. I have two follow-up questions there, and then we'll talk quickly about the financial regulatory reorganization that took place at the NPC. One is, how does the property market fit in with this consumption story, right? So this is something we've been talking about. Does the property market have to get fixed for consumers to feel confident, right? So, if can the property market be in the doldrums and households still go out and spend because there's a big wealth aspect there. How should we be thinking about that? And two, you laid out what they're trying to do very well. Do we think it's going to be successful? And really the ultimate question there is, do we think they're going to outperform significantly the growth target because all this is going to fall into place? Or are they not giving enough support to the economy and ultimately we barely limp over the growth target or even miss it? Those are two big ones, but I'll touch on those if you can quickly, and we'll obviously be able to track those and discuss them more throughout the rest of the year.
On the second one, I think ultimately we'll get to the growth target, because my sense is that we've seen this before. If consumption doesn't pull its weight, we'll see more investment in infrastructure. I don't think it's clearly not what they want, but that's always, in case of emergency, break glass. That's what they do. I think in terms of driving consumption, you're right. They've never done this before on this sort of scale. And so a lot of what they're going to be doing is quite experimental, and a lot of it's going to be left to local governments. So my expectation this year is that if consumption doesn't pop soon, we are going to see a constant drumbeat of more policy measures and experimentation all throughout the year until they're going to be throwing stuff against the wall until it sticks. Right?
We've already had some senior policy advisors talking about we need to push people to do home renovations, for example, right? So that's already, you're starting to see the signs of people trying to throw the spaghetti at the wall and come up with innovative ideas.
Absolutely. And then on the question of a housing sector recovery, that kind of is the elephant in the room, isn't it? Because again, if we're talking about regulators having to deal with something that they've never had to deal with before, housing has consistently gone up in value for the last 20 years. And so anybody who owned housing, their sense of personal and household wealth has just always increased relative to their property holdings. And now this year, well, that's different, right? So, people's expectations of how that asset might increase in value has probably changed. And as well as a lot of people are sort of feeling that perhaps they weren't as wealthy as they originally were. Now, the question is, how does this then feed into consumption? And it's a bit of an unknown quantity. Now, if we are starting to see, that we're fast approaching the bottoming out of the housing market, that's probably a good thing. If we start seeing things sort of climb out of a hole in the second half of the year, then that's going to be great for consumption. But the extent to which that this will dampen or complicate efforts to boost consumption, it's got to have an effect, but we're not quite sure as yet just how much of effect, because again, this is new territory.
Yeah, I go back, we've been doing these we haven't been doing the biweekly flash talks for all that long, but we've been doing the flash talks for a long time. And, we talked, mid last year, so, 18 months ago, about how there are three big kind of variables around growth: COVID policy, the property market, and household and business confidence. COVID's now off the table. So it's really just two main variables that are going to determine what this year looks like. Property policy, and there's a lot of debate. I think our view would be that we do seem to be looking like we're finally seeing the bottoming of property activity and moving potentially even to some positive territory by the end of the year, maybe even getting a little bit of positive growth out of that sector for this year. And then it comes back to the confidence among businesses and households and their ability to consume. Obviously, regulators are focused on both of those. They seem more focused on the confidence and consumption piece, but obviously we'll keep an eye on obviously the performance of the property market, but whether or not more support is forthcoming. So we're still, I would say, relatively optimistic on growth this year. I think the question in the market is, there were very high expectations for what China's growth performance would look like post zero COVID. In the early days in January into the Chinese New Year, things were looking good. Now that we've got the official data, there's some questions and the market's starting to wonder, were we too optimistic? Do we need to dial back our expectations, which would obviously then have an impact on Chinese linked asset prices? We think that questioning of the market's premature. We think they are going to be able to put in enough to not only hit, but likely surpass the growth target, and that all this will build towards quite strong growth towards the end of the year. We'll be kind of revisiting that view as we go, but that's kind of where we stand. So the market kind of starting to question its own expectations, its own high expectations on growth. We think that basically market actors shouldn't do that. We still believe basically in the strong growth narrative for this year for reasons we've laid out. Again, we'll kind of monitor and revisit that as we go throughout the year. We're already a little over time, but it's worth just spending a couple of minutes, Denny, finally. The other big thing that happened at the NPC this year is every 5 years, the government and party undergo a reorganization. And one of the biggest pieces of the government reorganization this year was in the financial sector. We're going to spend time on this in tomorrow's webcast and then or webinar, and then we're doing another one just for, just on the financial sector next week. So lots of flash talks going on. So we won't belabor it too much now, but walk us through the headlines of what happened and our key takeaways so far.
Okay, the big change is that the banking and insurance regulator is getting a new name, and it's getting a bump in status. So it's now going to be the National Financial Regulatory Administration. Now, the real significance of that change is in the name. It's the previous regulatory regime, despite the fact that back 5 years ago, banking and insurance had two different regulators. Then in 2018, they were brought together, but still the focus of the organization has been as a banking and an insurance regulator. Now what they're trying to do is change that this is not about silos anymore, that the regulator isn't regulating specific financial institutions. It is regulating the financial sector with the exception of the capital markets. The securities regulator still has its own special agency. And the reason that they're doing that is that they're taking a slightly different approach to financial regulation. The PBOC will kind of be at the center of setting the rules, and the new financial regulator will be at the heart of monitoring and effectively, kicking ass and taking names. It will be the body to ensure compliance. And that's kind of, that bifurcation is a model that's been pursued increasingly in countries all around the world. So that is the real significance of what's going on. And then there's just been a little bit of musical chairs going on, so that, the responsibility for consumer protection and investment protection, investor protection has gone from the central bank and the securities regulator respectively, and are now at this new overarching financial regulatory body. Meanwhile, the NDRC has lost responsibility for approving the issuance of enterprise bonds, and that's gone to the securities regulator. I mean, that was a dinosaur legacy, bifurcation that was hung over from long ago turf wars between the NDRC and the CSRC. That's finally been dealt with. So a little bit of musical chairs going on, but the big issue is that this newly empowered financial regulatory agency, which is being born out of the banking and insurance regulator, will have more authority, and its focus is going to be very much more on ensuring financial sector stability rather than being focused on specific institutions.
Yeah, so ultimately, I think my takeaway is it's supposed to be, we'll see how it works out in practice, a rationalization of the system, making clearer responsibilities among the regulators and dividing the various responsibilities more clearly as well, so that each regulator is kind of focused on a clearer, more discrete set of KPIs, set of regulatory tasks, and so that the system, in theory, should work a little bit more rationally, and there's less regulatory arbitrage and regulatory overlap. So we'll dive into that more in future flash talks. Of course, as I said, we'll obviously monitor the progress and these and other flash talks, these biweekly flash talks and others, to see how it all pans out. But until as we do that, please feel free to reach out to us with questions. You can email Denny and I. We're always happy to do one-on-one briefings or follow up. But with that, we'll leave it until next time, Denny. Thanks for the time. Enjoy these catch-ups as always, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good, Andrew.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.